Okay. Yeah. So, again, thank you for making yourself available for today's meeting. As I have said, we have to meet today, even if the prelim examination has not yet been conducted for our course, so that we could be able to finish everything as the course intends us to complete. So we will now be moving to, yeah, before that, I would like to congratulate everyone for earning a good score in the second quiz. I think there were two. Yeah, there were two students who got a perfect score in the second quiz. Okay, and most of you got good scores in the set quiz. That would only mean that indeed you prepared well and you really have been so serious studying the learning content of the lesson prior to the second quiz. So may we have then the continuation of our the discussion on lesson three, and please take note that there are two important topics under lesson three. Okay, so allow me to share to share my entire screen so that you would see the presentation. Okay. Okay, so for lesson three, may we be reminded first of the focus of this lesson, and of course, the learning outcomes and the performance-based assessment that you need to be aware of, including the learning activities, okay, for this part of our course. So lesson three will focus on program outcomes and student learning outcomes with the following intended learning outcomes that while discussing this lesson or while you are to participate or engage yourself through this lesson, you will be able to differentiate a program outcome from a learning outcome. What's the difference between a program outcome from that of a learning outcome? And the second one, that you should be able to explain the three domains of learning and the levels of each domain. And your performance-based assessment is for you to draft samples of learning outcomes for each level of each learning domain. So there are different levels under each learning domain. You just have to draft sample learning outcomes for each of these levels. Then the following activities that we would be doing, of course, we're doing the video conferencing now, not only through Zoom Cloud, but we are making use of the Google Meet. Then there will also be a forum as your activity. Then there will be a listing activity. We hope you could be able to do this. And of course, a quiz to culminate your understanding of lesson three. Okay? So these are the things that you need to expect, that you have to expect as we go through discussing the different topics under lesson three. Now, we proceed to the first topic under lesson three, which is about writing and assessing student learning outcomes. So when we say assessing learning outcomes, when we do assessment or when we write student learning outcomes, we are actually describing learners' knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviors, or values. Okay? Remember that we said in outcomes-based education, we said that we have to start at the end in mind. And the end in mind that we are referring here are things that we expect our students do, are things that we would like our students do or would like our students to achieve. Okay, through through our discussions or through our teaching and learning activities. Hence, the learning outcomes. Okay, the learning outcomes are statements to provide a description or to clarify what kind of knowledge, what skills and attitudes or even behaviors or values we would like our learners learn, or we would like our learners achieve or attain in the context of the discussion. As Leo Buscaglia said, change is the end result of all true learning. True learning in outcomes-based education is about the ability of the learner or our students to transfer their understanding to real-life situations. And this is change that we would like to happen. Okay? That change is about our students ready, okay, to transfer, ready to apply into another context the things that they are learning from us. Okay? Leo Buscaglia is a well-known educator. Now, for this presentation, for this presentation, there are four. Okay, there are four parts that we need to look into. First, the definition. What do we mean by student learning outcomes? Okay. Then after that, we look into the components. What are the components of smarter student learning outcomes? Then number three is about writing SLOs, how to write good student learning outcomes. And last, how to measure attainment of these student learning outcomes. So referring to assessing SLOs or student learning outcomes. Ano ang kahulugan ng bunga ng pagkatuto? Titingnan natin ano ang elemento ng mga bunga ng pagkatuto o magandang pagkakasulat ng mga bunga ng pagkatuto. Paano isulat ang mga bunga ng pagkatuto, at ang pangapat ay paano tasahin ang mga bunga ng pagkatuto. So these are the four parts of the presentation. Allow me first to stop sharing the screen because I think there are some of your classmates are coming in our class. Let me just check. Okay. Okay, so these are the four parts, that we will be discussing in this presentation. Now we proceed first to the introduction. What are SLOs? What are student learning outcomes? Okay. In identifying or writing our student learning outcomes, we always have to ask ourselves this question. By the end of a program of study, or by the end of this course, or by the end of this lesson, by the end of this unit of study, what do we want students to be able to do? Okay, what kind of skill we expect our learners to demonstrate, our learners to exemplify, our learners to model? And how can our students demonstrate the knowledge the program intended them to learn? So these questions would guide us over the learning outcomes that we would like our learners achieve at the end of our discussion of a certain chapter, of a certain course, or of a certain unit of study. Hence, student learning outcomes, or SLOs, describe the knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviors, or values students should be able to demonstrate at the end of a program of study. And a combination of methods may be used to assess student attainment of learning outcomes. Hence, with these guide questions in writing learning outcomes and the definition of student learning outcome, it has to be noted that learning outcomes are statements of what students will learn during their mobility experience as you describe it in the activities. So anything that we would like them to do, anything that we expect them demonstrate, anything that we expect them to understand or to learn, these are what we mean by learning outcomes. Lahat ng mga bagay-bagay na nais nating may pamalas ng ating mga mag-aaral, mga bagay-bagay na nais nating na kailangan nilang magawa, kailangan nilang maipakita kung paano gawin, mga bagay-bagay na patungkol doon sa kanilang pag-unawa sa kanilang kakayanan at sa mga mahalagang bagay na kailangan nilang matutunan tungkol sa leksyon o pagkatapos talakayan ng isang leksyon o isang paksa. Ito yung mga tinatawag nating mga bunga ng pagkatuto. Okay. Learning outcomes or fruit of learning, di ba? Mga bunga ng pagkatuto. Now, with that introduction, we can say then that learning outcomes, okay, learning outcomes refer to statements that would show demonstration of learning. The key word or key phrase, demonstration of learning, to define learning outcomes would mean that we need to describe what students should be able to demonstrate, represent, or produce upon completion of a program of study. For example, as I have said a while back, our intended learning outcome, okay, also referred to is a type of student learning outcome. And when I say that you should be able to write, for example, write sample learning outcomes, that is what I would like you to do at the end of discussing lesson 3. And that is what we mean by learning outcome. That is an example of a learning outcome. Take note also that when we write learning outcomes, they have to rely to active verbs. Okay? They rely on active verbs that identify what the student should be able to demonstrate, represent, or produce. That's why in our early discussion, okay, as regards outcomes-based education, when we write our learning outcomes, these learning outcomes have to make use of specific verbs that would show that would show our students, okay, that would show our students that these activities have to really be achieved by them. Okay, that these activities are possible to be achieved or possible to be demonstrated. So we make use of active verbs. Later on, okay, these verbs will be identified according to the domain it speaks of. According to the domain they will speak of, should I say. They will speak of. Because as I've said in the introduction a while back, in the presentation of lesson 3, we said that there are different domains of learning, and each domain, okay, has different levels. So each of these levels, in each of these domains, okay, will make use of distinct verbs, okay, when we craft our learning outcomes. Now, take note also that student learning outcomes also have the following characteristics or key features. That SLOs should be aligned with the institution's curriculum and co-curriculum outcomes. So that's why we said in our previous discussion, the intended learning outcomes of our course should be aligned with the program learning outcomes of teacher education, and that the program learning outcomes of teacher education in USL should also be aligned with the institutional learning outcomes or ILOs. So we have the institutional learning outcomes. Then after the institutional learning outcomes or ILOs, we have the program learning outcomes. Then after the program learning outcomes, we also have the intended learning outcomes. The intended learning outcomes that we are referring here per course, and even the learning outcomes per topic, these are what we mean by student learning outcomes. Okay? Then we also have, it should be collaboratively authored and collectively accepted. Please take note that when we draft our learning outcomes, we have to make sure that our students could actually be able to do what we expect them to do. Because if our expectations through our learning outcomes are so high, then certainly students might find a difficulty of achieving it. And minsan, ganito nangyayari. There's what we call as Pygmalion effect in education. Ano ibig sabihin Pygmalion effect? Usually nasa LEP exam ito. When we say Pygmalion effect, kapag sobrang taas na expectation ng guro sa mga estudyante at hindi niya binaba ito, at yung mga estudyante ay hindi naman nagawa yung napakataas na ekspektasyon ng guro, yung guro madi-dismotivate o madi-disappoint. And the feeling of disappointment because of your high expectations which were not met by students is what we mean by Pygmalion effect. Ang mangyayari sa guro ay tatamarin na siya magturo, o di kaya masisira yung kanyang pananaw o perspektibo tungkol sa mga estudyante, masisira yung kanyang kaigihan para magpatuloy sa pagtuturo o para mapaganda pa lalo ang pagtuturo niya sa nasabing klase. Okay, this is what we mean by Pygmalion effect. Now, the student learning outcomes also should be quantitatively or qualitatively assessed during student studies. So meaning to say, our learning outcomes should make use of both tests and non-tests. Dito papasok yung tawag nating test and non-test. Because it says here that SLOs should be quantitatively, we are referring to test here, and qualitatively assessed, we are referring to our interpretations of the quantitative result of students' tests. Okay, these are what we mean by student learning outcomes. Okay, now before we continue, may we have an opportunity for you to ask your clarificatory questions before we continue to the next slide. Okay, sige. Please open your camera, turn on your camera for the opportunity for you to ask important questions. Diyan, hindi ka pa enrolled sa assessment 1 dati?
Sir, enrolled po.
Okay. Okay, sige. Okay, any question? Mar, o nasa ano si Mar? Nasa ilalim ng puno ng kainito ba iyan? Mar, puno ba yan ng kainito? Hindi.
Yes, yes sir, yes sir. Nagpapatrabaho kasi kami kanina, kaya tapos na sila. So inaayos ko yung mga gamit.
Sige. Okay, any question?
Sir,
Yes, Jomel. We listen to Jomel.
yes. Clarify. Kapag learning outcomes, sir, these are the skills and these are parang skills and competencies that a student should know, and the achievement of the learning outcomes are the learning expectations, sir. Is it correct, sir?
The learning expectations are usually the learning expectations are usually communicated to students through learning outcomes. So the learning outcomes themselves are our expectations of what our students should achieve at the end of the discussion or at the end of the topic or a lesson chapter. Jamel. Okay?
Yes, sir. Sir, how about ano yun? How about ano, sir? May difference po ba ang learning outcomes sa learning goals?
Okay. In the video, I hope that some of you started already the requirement, no? This is a video assessment. It's clearly defined that goals, okay, that goals are broader than learning outcomes. Okay? When we say goals, these pertain to our expectations, the expectations of the whole institution, the whole educational institution. Okay, that's what we mean by goals. So they are broader in context compared to the learning outcomes. The learning outcomes that we are referring here pertain to the implemented curriculum. The implemented curriculum that we are referring here is the actual teaching and learning process that teachers are facilitating inside the classroom. Okay. Ang goals, masyadong malawak iyan. For example, educational goals. The goals of DepEd, for example. The goals of USL, for example. This pertain to the institution, okay, as a whole. Okay, but these goals have to serve as basis in doing the institutional learning outcomes, the program learning outcomes, and even the student learning outcomes. Okay, so I hope that you already have started watching the video of the video requirement that I asked you to finish. Okay, because it's in that video that these concepts are well discussed. Okay, thank you, Jamel.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, Jamel. May we have another person to accommodate for this opportunity? You may ask questions. You may also check if you have understood. Okay, if your understanding of the presentation is similar understanding that you have with your classmate, or you may also would like to add okay to provide additional information as regards the topic, especially if you have read in advance about student learning outcomes. Daryl, any question?
None, sir.
None. Okay, how about the others? Sir, okay, Jude, sir, what makes a good student learning outcomes? That is what we are to discuss in the succeeding part of our discussion, Jude. We will be discussing that later. The characteristics of good learning outcomes. That's part of our presentation.
Your
Okay,
question.
question? Yeah, Mar?
Can you hear me? And am I audible?
Yes, Mar?
Yeah. Regarding learning outcomes,
Mhm.
those are the outcomes that students supposed to do, no? How about if hindi nagawa ng students, anong intervention ang gagawin ng teacher? Will
Okay.
he or she alter the learning outcomes or change his or her teaching style?
Yeah, that's also a good question. Please take note that we have to connect our discussion, okay, our discussion today to our previous discussion. We said that learning outcomes are what we expect our students do at the end of a certain discussion or at the end of our lesson. That's why we said in our previous discussion that as much as possible, we make use of ongoing assessment. Because ongoing assessment or formative assessment even, actually specifically the formative assessment, should they help prepare our learners towards the achievement of these learning outcomes. So magkakaugnay yung mga ito, Mar. Okay? So how to make sure that our students are attaining, our students will achieve, okay, the learning outcomes we expect them to. Then we have to do our part as teachers. That's why we make use of different types of assessment so that these learning outcomes are achieved by our students. If in case that the learning outcomes are not achieved by the student, maybe there's a question already of whether the kind of teaching and learning activities that they did, okay, are appropriate for them or inappropriate for them to contribute towards the attainment of the learning outcomes. So magkakakonektado lahat ng mga talakayan natin. Huwag natin kalimutan yung mga natutunan natin ng mga nakaraang talakayan. Kasi ang mga nakaraang talakayan natin makakatulong para lalo pong maipaliwanag, para lalo pang mapalalim yung pag-unawa natin sa talakayang ginagawa natin ngayon. Okay? That's the purpose of ongoing assessment. Okay? The ongoing assessment, the use of all forms of tests, non-tests, or any teaching learning activities that would prepare our learners, we do those because we would like to prepare them achieve, okay, our expectations. And these expectations are written in the form of learning outcomes. Okay, Mar?
Thank you, sir. That's a wonderful insight, no? Connected na talaga lahat. So, dapat appropriate talaga. At walang measurement error dito. Parang, thank you, sir.
That's right.
Thank you, thank you.
Okay, papasok na naman si measurement error. Okay? Kasi kung di na-achieve si learning outcome, certainly there's a measurement error. So we have to troubleshoot what went wrong in the process. Okay, that's how we do in the teaching and learning process. Okay, thank you, Mar. Any more question?
Sir,
Yes, Jennifer?
sir, regarding dun po sa three domains, which is which are the cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Sir, does the traditional assessment, or what we called as um, paper and pencil test, can measure na-measure po ba niya yung, I mean, psychomotor, sir? Na-measure niya po ba yung traditional assessment, which is the paper and test assessment?
Yeah. There will be a separate discussion as regards the domains of learning. Okay, there's a separate presentation on that. And there's also a separate discussion as regards test construction. And at the test construction, even paper pencil test now can actually help can actually help development of students' psychomotor or even affective skills. We will be learning that, Jennifer, later on, because we will have a separate right after our discussion about this presentation. We will proceed to our discussion as regards domains of learning. Okay, and later on, siguro sa finals, we will also be I think midterms, we will also be discussing about test construction. How to construct tests to ensure that even if it's a paper and pencil test, we can still help our students develop their psychomotor, even affective skills. We will be looking into that, Jennifer. Okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you po.
Okay, any more question? No more. Okay? Dian is nodding her head. It may be an indication that she understood the lesson. Okay? So we continue our discussion. Yogi Berra, okay, stated, you got to be careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. That's true. Okay. Similarly, in the teaching and learning process, if we do not know where to go, then certainly the kind of activities that we would be doing, the kind of teaching learning activities that we would be implementing inside our classes will certainly not allow us to go to the supposed achievement of what we intend our students do or what we intend our students demonstrate. Okay? Kaya nga sabi natin sa outcomes-based education, we always have to start at the end in mind. We should know why we have to do these things in class, why we have to let our students do these things. We should be able to identify a definite reason, a definite purpose, a definite end or a definite culmination of the lesson or of the discussion. Learning outcomes describe what students are able to demonstrate in terms of knowledge, skills, and values. That's why I've said we will later be discussing about the domains of learning, the 3 domains of learning. And also learning outcomes, okay, should have a clear articulation. It's a clear articulation. And this clear articulation of what we expect our students do, written in the form of learning outcomes, serves as the foundation to evaluating the effectiveness of the teaching and learning process. Again, as we have said, what measures real teaching is learning. And learning is defined as the achievement of the learning outcomes. Again, the ultimate measure of teaching, or what measures real teaching, real teaching is true learning. And true learning is defined as the achievement of learning outcomes. This is the change that we would like to have to our students. The change is the achievement of the learning outcome or our expectations for them. Not of them, but expectations for them. Because everything that we expect should be something that would be beneficial or advantageous for our students. Now, please take note that when we write, dito na yung tanong ni Jude ata, okay, that when we write our learning outcomes, they have to be smarter. Diba? Sabi natin noon, pag learning objectives, they have to be smart, diba? But for learning outcomes, they have to be smarter with additional of letter E and letter R. Okay. Smarter, okay, as for specific, they have to be very specific. That's why we have to make use of specific action verbs. Okay, when we write, okay, our learning outcomes, they have to be meaningful. When we say meaningful, when we say dalawa may ibig sabihin ng meaningful, it's meaningful or measurable. When we say meaningful, the activities or the outcome that we expect them to do should be something that respects. Okay, should be something that would that respects student's context, student's situation. It has to be measurable because the outcome has to be quantified. Tama? Pag measurable, it has to be quantified. Pag meaningful, it has to be qualified. Okay, when we qualify learning outcomes, a learning outcome is of quality if, okay, learning outcome is of quality if that learning outcome targets the context of the learners. When we say targeting the context of the learner, it's appropriate, okay, to the needs and differences of our students in class. And when we say measurable, okay, they can be quantified. We need to say it can we can measure or we can assign scores to we can assign scores if in case that our students could be able to demonstrate or achieve these learning outcomes. Letter A, they're achievable, kaya ng estudyante, or attainable. Letter R, they have to be relevant. Magagamit nila sa pang-araw-araw nilang buhay kapag pang-araw-araw buhay kanilang matutunan ang kanilang magagawang bunga ng pagkatuto. Timely or time-bound. Okay, when you say timely or time-bound, that they can be able to do the activity in a duration of time, in a pre-identified duration of time, and that we can be able to evaluate, okay, the said outcome, whether when you say evaluate, whether this outcome could actually provide us a quality judgment as regards student learning. And we can also re-evaluate this learning outcome. When we say re-evaluate, meaning to say we do re-evaluation for us to check whether this outcome should no longer be expected of the students because it's too high for them, or maybe this learning outcome has yet to be improved because it can actually be easily achieved by our students. Kapag sabi natin si learning outcome, okay, hindi siya madaling ma-achieve, hindi rin siya mahirap ma-achieve. Kailangan nandun na siya sa moderate level or moderate stage. Okay, so this is what we mean by smarter. Okay, learning outcomes have to be smarter. Okay, so now we will now be looking into the components of smarter student learning outcomes. Okay, there are three essential components of a measurable learning outcome. Okay, we have the student learning behavior. We are referring to the action verbs or active verbs that we need to use. Okay, student learning behaviors. We have appropriate assessment methods, and we have specific student performance criteria or criteria for success. Okay. For example, write sample learning outcomes, okay, to demonstrate one's understanding of the three domains of learning. Okay, again, write sample learning outcomes to demonstrate, okay, to demonstrate one's understanding of the three domains of learning. Where is the student learning behavior there? Right, that's a behavior that I would like them to do. That they are to write sample learning outcomes. And what is the method, the assessment method? To demonstrate. Demonstration is assessment method. And what is the specific performance criteria? That they should be able to demonstrate their understanding of the three learning domains. That is this performance criteria or criteria for success. If they could be able to write learning outcomes along these three domains of learning, then that is the criteria that we are referring to, that is the criteria that they need to satisfy. That is a perfect example of a learning outcome having these three components: student learning behaviors, appropriate assessment methods, specific student performance criteria. Okay, Now, when writing a measurable learning outcome, it's important to focus on student behavior. That's why when we write our student learning outcomes, we have to always start. We always have to start with the behavior that we would like our learners to. Write sample learning outcomes. At the start of the learning outcome, I made mention a while back. And that is the focus. Okay, it has to be stated, the focus has to be stated in the beginning of the learning outcome statement. Okay. And to focus on student behavior, we have to use simple, specific action verbs. Again, we said in our previous discussion that these verbs, that these very broad verbs should not be used when we write our learning outcomes. Can you still remember these three verbs? Anyone? Can you still remember the three verbs that we should not use when we are to write learning outcomes?
No.
These verbs, yes.
Ano yung mga yon?
No, learn, understand.
Okay,
No, learn,
good.
understand, I think.
Good, Mark. Thank you for remembering, or still perfectly remembering those three verbs. No, understand, and what's the other one, Mark?
And learn. Learn, sir, learn.
Okay. Learn may also do understand or learn. Okay, know and value. Okay, so these are the verbs that we should not use when we are to write our learning outcomes. Okay, we continue. And also, we have to select appropriate assessment methods. Tignan natin kung yung pinapagawa ba natin sa ating mga mag-aaral, yung ipapagawa ba natin sa kanila ay akma para magawa nila yung nasabing behavior. Para may pamalas sila yung nasasabing student behavior. Okay. For example, write sample learning outcomes to demonstrate one's understanding of the three domains of learning. Is demonstration appropriate assessment method for students to be able to write learning outcomes? Appropriate siya. Okay? Tama yun. Kapag sinabi mo na complete a two-column chart. Complete a two-column chart to compare and contrast. Or balik rin natin. We focus on student behavior. Compare and contrast. Okay? Compare and contrast amalgamation and assimilation using a Venn diagram. Or compare and contrast amalgamation from assimilation using a two-column chart. Which of the two learning outcomes are correctly stated, considering appropriateness of assessment method to that of the student behavior?
The first
The former.
The former is
The first one.
yung through two-column
The
chart?
first one. Ato.
The first one, okay, good. That's the use of the former and the latter. When you say the latter, we're referring to the second example. When we say the former, we're referring to the first example. So the first example, the use of Venn diagram is more appropriate, tama?
Okay.
More appropriate to compare and contrast certain concepts. Okay, kasi meron compare and contrast. Pag sinabi kong compare lang, then a two-column chart may do. Okay, klaro yon? So you also have to check appropriateness of the assessment method that we use, okay, to that of the student behavior. And of course, state desired performance criteria. you know, in 21st century, in outcomes-based education, usually itong stated, itong performance criteria are hidden in the learning outcome statement. Hidden siya usually. Okay? It's hidden. For example, dun sa sinabi natin na compare and contrast amalgamation from an assimilation using a Venn diagram. Kung makikita ninyo, hidden yung performance criteria. But what is the performance criteria actually there? That there has to be a clear, okay, a clear statements as regards the similarities and differences of two important social processes, that is amalgamation and assimilation. So that's the performance criteria, but it's hidden in this statement. Ay usually hidden po si performance criteria. Okay? Now, when we say focus on student behavior, learning outcomes are about what students are able to demonstrate. That's why we are referring here to the verb or to the learning tasks that we would ask them to. Right? The learning tasks is the student behavior that we are referring to. Learning outcomes are not about what the instructors can provide, but what the students can demonstrate. So it's about the demonstration of what we expect them to do. Student behavior is about the learning tasks that our students have to demonstrate, have to do. And that's what we mean by student behavior. Now, look at this. We try to check, are these learning outcomes? You look at the examples. First, sabi niya, offer opportunities for students to master integrated use of information technology. The program will engage a significant number of students in formalized language cultural studies program. The students who participate in critical thinking seminars will write 2 essays on critical thinking skills. The students will be exposed to exceptionality in learning disabilities, including visual and perception disabilities. Are these learning outcomes? Anyone? Are these outcomes?
Sir, hindi.
Okay, bakit hindi? Sino yun? Sige.
Sir, feeling ko goals sila.
Sino po sila?
Diyan, sir.
Diyan. Bakit hindi Diyan?
Sir, kasi hindi siya... Wait lang, sir. Kasi hindi... Sir, hindi ko alam i-explain.
Ano yung common sa kanila ba?
Parang plan siya ng teacher, sir, pero hindi siya for the students. Parang sa teacher po.
That's right. It's not directed towards the students. Okay, but it's actually a target of a certain program to involve students. Okay, but it does not speak of the actual expectations for students. Okay, for example, sabi dito, offer opportunities for students to master integrated use of information technology. So it pertains to a program offering an opportunity for students. The program will engage a significant number. That's a program. Okay? The students who participate in critical writing seminars will write 2 essays on critical thinking skills. Okay, the critical thinking seminar is a program. The students will be exposed to exceptionality in learning, including visual and perception disabilities. Exposing students, the word expose as a verb is not a measurable learning outcome. Okay, so we check. When we say learning outcomes, we have to make use of simple, specific action verbs. When writing learning outcomes, We focus on student behavior and use simple specific action verbs to describe what students are expected to demonstrate. The wording should be something as follows. Students will be able to. Okay, so laging meron yan. That's the prompt that we have to make use when we start writing our learning outcomes. Students will be able to. That's the stem or the prompt. Okay. Now, the following are examples of learning outcomes. The students will be able to apply principles of evidence-based medicine to determine clinical diagnosis and formulate and implement acceptable treatment modalities. Please take note that, okay, please take note that there are 3 verbs, okay? There are 3 verbs in these learning outcome. But please take note that the main verb is to apply. Because when you do apply the principles, that would also mean that students could actually be able to formulate and implement acceptable treatment modalities. Okay, apply principles of evidence-based medicine to determine clinical diagnosis and formulate and implement acceptable treatment modalities. Now, what is the student behavior here? What is the student behavior in learning outcome number 1? Anyone? What's the student behavior? It's
Apply principles.
Apply.
very good. Apply principles. What is the assessment method? What is the assessment method?
Formulate and implement acceptable treatment modalities, sir.
Okay, doing treatment modalities. Very good. Doing treatment modalities. That's good. Okay, what is the performance criteria? Hidden siya. What is the performance criteria? It's the what is the performance criteria?
Implement.
Ha? Sino nag-recite kanina? Sorry, I the Google Meet I cannot see who's talking kasi when I do sharing of presentation. Sino nagsasalita?
Princess, sir.
Ano?
Princess po.
Princess. Yes. Princess. Asan dyan ang princess, saan dyan ang criteria?
Sir, I think implement acceptable treatment modalities din, sir.
Okay, that is actually the assessment methodology. Okay? In doing treatment modalities, what should they have to observe?
They should apply the principles of
Okay, good. Okay. The criteria is the application, the application of the complete principles of evidence-based medicine. Kasi dapat maipakita nila, that's the criteria. Dapat maipakita nila yung principles of evidence-based medicine. Okay, that's right. Okay, now number 2. Students will be able to articulate cultural and socio-economic differences and the significance of these differences for instructional planning. What is the student behavior?
Articulate.
Articulate.
Articulate, cultural.
Articulate.
Very good.
Articulate.
Now, what is the assessment method?
It's hidden. So parang Venn diagram din siya.
Trying to differentiate.
Okay. You have to differentiate.
To differentiate the cultural and socioeconomic.
Differentiation technique.
Differentiate. Significance of these differences. Kuna na
Ay, wait lang.
The difference there is not a verb, okay?
Oo, instead of.
To articulate cultural and socioeconomic differences and significance of these differences for instructional planning.
Parang hidden naman yung method.
Ha?
Differentiate.
Ayun yun.
Is it
Differentiate.
differentiate?
Differentiation technique.
For making instructional planning.
Hindi, wait. Hindi, start. Ano may
Okay, good. Nabanggit ni Joshua ba yun? Si Joshua ba yun?
articulate ulit sa in
Yes,
other words?
sir.
Ha? Ano?
Joshua ba yun?
Instructional
Yung
planning.
lalaking salita kanina?
Making
It's
instructional planning.
instructional planning.
Making instructional
Okay, it's instructional
planning.
planning. That's right, Joshua. And the criteria is
articulating the
okay,
cultural
complete
differences.
okay, identification of the cultural and socioeconomic differences in doing the instructional planning. Okay, good. Number 3, students will be able to use technology effectively in the delivery of instruction, assessment, and professional development. Student focus, student behavior.
Use.
Use the technology, sir, effectively.
Use technology. Okay,
Use
good. Now, how about the assessment method?
Delivering instruction, assessment, and
Delivering instruction,
Okay, good.
professional
professional
development, sir.
development.
Okay, good. Delivery of instruction, assessment. Okay, and professional development. Okay, so students will be asked to deliver a certain instruction or to conduct a certain training using technology. So the assessment is the delivery of instruction or professional development. And what is the criteria?
By using the
Using
technology, sir.
technology
Okay,
effectively.
Application of technology.
Technology. Okay, that's the criteria. Good. Sino yung isang babae nagsasalita? I'm talking to Mar, Joshua, and the other one. Princess ulit.
Ako po yun, sir.
Sino yan?
Daryl po. Daryl po, sir.
Ha?
Daryl po.
Daryl. Sorry, Daryl. Si Daryl Akang. Okay. Akang. Daryl, tama? Hindi nagsalita si
Yes, sir.
Joshua? Magkaboses kasi kayong dalawa. Okay, Daryl.
Ako yung nagbanggit sa making, sir. Making instructional planning.
Okay, si Morgado yung kanina. Okay, Daryl. Okay, good. Now, number 4, students will be able to evaluate the need for assistance technology for their students. Okay? Ito, hidden si criteria and even the assessment. Okay, hidden si criteria and even the assessment. Because the student focus, the student behavior itself, okay, pertains to the student behavior itself pertains also to the assessment methodology, okay, that is being used. Okay, so these are good examples of learning outcomes. Okay, we continue. Remember that when we write our learning outcomes, the Bloom's taxonomy can be a useful resource. Okay, in developing learning outcomes, the Bloom's taxonomy of objectives can be a useful resource. This Bloom's taxonomy will guide us appropriately on how we are supposed to draft or to write our expectations in the form of learning outcomes for our students. Now, action verbs result in overt behavior that can be observed and measured. That's why we are making use of action verbs, because these are automatically, these are observable and measurable. Remember that verbs that are unclear and verbs that relate to unobservable or unmeasurable behaviors should be avoided when we write our learning outcomes. Examples of these are the following. Again, ito yung mga hindi natin gagamitin when we write our learning outcomes. Appreciate, understand, know, learn, become aware of, become familiar with. So please remember these verbs that we have to avoid when we write our learning outcomes, particularly the component student behavior, because these are unobservable and unmeasurable. Remember, as we have said, one of the key characteristics of a good learning outcome is for that outcomes to be quantified. And using these verbs, okay, will certainly not allow you to, will certainly not permit you to measure, okay, student behavior or student outcomes. Now, this is the cognitive level of Bloom's Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. Ito yung, the old version is the K-Kaase, K, Ka, Se. That's the old version. Okay, that was in 1956. But in the 21st century teaching and learning, we already have a new terms, okay, to represent each of the K-Kaase components. We have remembering, understanding, transferring, relating, creating, and judging. Okay? So ito na yung bagong relating or the ito tinatawag pa rin siya application yung remember, understand, apply, analyze, create, and evaluate. Okay? But for us to not be confused, we make use of this remembering, understanding, transferring, relating, creating, and judging. So these are Bloom's Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. And the verb for each of these level, okay, for each of these level will help us, okay, will assist us in writing our learning outcomes. So please take note that there are two. Okay, looking at these verbs, we also mean the development of skills of our students. And looking at these six levels or these six levels, then we have to also six categories, should I say, of the cognitive domain. We are just referring to the cognitive domain. We can divide this into two. Okay, the first three are what we mean by the lower order thinking skills or LOTS, and the second three are the higher order thinking skills or HOTS. Okay, so what are the LOTS? We have remembering, understanding, and transferring. What are the HOTS? We have relating, creating, and judging. Though the highest level, okay, of these higher order thinking skills is creating or synthesis, because we said that learning is creating. In the 21st century, in outcomes-based education, learning has to be creating. That is, students should be able to create something out from what they have understood in class. Okay, when you say create, it brings out students' creativity and innovative skill, okay, to make use of what they have learned into a new context, into a new way of doing things. That is creating. Okay, so ito, when we say remembering, it's about recalling terms, facts, and details without necessarily understanding the concept. It's merely a rote memory, ROTE, a rote memory. Ibig sabihin, it's merely about memorizing facts, memorizing key terms, memorizing facts. Okay, these are what we mean by this level. Okay, so and to recall terms, okay, or to do memorization of facts or important concepts or theories in a lesson, we can make use of the following verbs: count, define, draw, identify, label, list, locate, name, outline, point, quote, recite, record, repeat, select, state, and write. What is the definition of can you recite? When you ask a question, for example, what is the definition of blah, blah, blah? That is actually targeting the remembering level. Can you recite the multiplication table of 6? Then that is remembering level. Okay? When did the first martial law in the Philippines take place? Okay, that is remembering. Okay. Where was Marcos born? That is remembering. Who was the president of the Philippines when who was the president of the Philippines when the Buntun Bridge was constructed? Who was? That question targets remembering level. Okay. How many senators do we currently? How many senators does the Philippine government uh, has, for example? That is under remembering. Okay. Now, comprehension is understanding and summarizing describe main ideas in own words. It's comprehension. When you provide your own definition of a certain concept or a certain key term in the lesson, then that is comprehension. Because you can already make use of your own words to explain something, then that is comprehension. Okay? So verbs under comprehension are the following. Later on, we will be discussing specific sample learning outcomes when we discuss the different levels of each of the domains of learning. For now, we'll just have to focus on the Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive domain. Okay? So we have these verbs under comprehension or understanding: associate, classify, convert, describe, differentiate, discuss, distinguish, estimate, explain, interpret, match, paraphrase, predict, recognize, select, summarize, and translate. For example, in your own words, okay, define photosynthesis. If you can define photosynthesis in your own words and you did not just merely recite a given definition based on a book or based on the textbook, then that would mean that you have that understanding level or comprehension level. What steps are required in writing learning outcomes? That is comprehension. Describe the kinds of roots or flowers. Okay, that is comprehension. Okay, and the highest level under the lower order thinking skills is what we term as application. Apply or transfer learning to own life or to context different from the one in which it was learned. So magkaiba po si pag sabi ng application or transfer, okay, meaning to say you can actually make use of what you have learned into life context or into life situations. And verbs under this include apply, build, calculate, classify, compare, complete, contrast, construct, demonstrate, illustrate, modify, operate, practice, relate, solve, and use. If you would be asked of giving an example that has affected you, for example, give an example give an example of a simulation in your community. Okay? Example of a simulation is, I am an Itawes, for example, and I live in an Ibanag community, and because of my exposure living in an Ibanag community that has affected me to learn, okay, how to speak a few of the Ibanag words. Okay, that's an example of a simulation. Give me an example, for example, of amalgamation. My mother who is an Itawes married my father. My father who is an Itawes married my mother who is an Ibanag. Okay, and it's because of the mix of Ibanag and Itawes in me that I am aware of the culture of the Itawes and the culture of the Ibanag, then that's an example of amalgamation. So citing examples is actually under application level. If alive today, what do you think he would do about? Okay, so these are sample prompts that you can make use to target this level. Okay, so then of course we have the last three under the higher order thinking skills: analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. When we say analysis, it's breaking material into parts. So when you break when you break a whole into parts, for you to be able to understand the relationship among these parts, then that's what we mean by analysis. Okay, terms such as analyze, categorize, compose, debate, detect, diagram, differentiate, distinguish, group, infer, investigate, prioritize, relate, research, separate, sort, transform. If you would be asked what factors Okay, what factors distinguish, okay, assimilation from amalgamation? So you have to look into the different parts of the social process. So for you to be able to answer this question, and that is what we mean by analysis. In what ways, okay, for example, in what ways can you help, reduce the use of plastic? Okay? In what ways? That can target both application and analysis. How would life be different if, how would life be different if Marcos, if Marcos, didn't win, or if Marcos didn't serve as one of the presidents of the country? Okay, so you analyze. Okay, so that's it. Now, we also have the next one is synthesis. It's creating something new by combining parts to form a unique solution to a problem. Okay, a unique solution. Adapt, assemble, combine, compare, compose, create, design, formulate, generalize, integrate, invent, organize, plan, prepare, prescribe, revise, specify. How can you put these ideas into action? Okay, for example, we were discussing about global warming. Okay? And maraming mga ideyas ang mga classmates mo, halimbawa, ang estudyante mo, kung paano ma-mitigate ang effect ng global warming. Then after identifying, okay, after you ask, they analyze, no, what are the, for example, what are the effects, okay, of global warming, okay, and how do we mitigate, okay, these effects of global warming? Nagbigay sila ng mga mitigation, okay? Then after that, you ask them, now, with all these mitigation strategies that you have shared in class, okay, what can we do now? How can we make use of these strategies now to propose a project, okay, reducing or mitigating the effect of global warming? That is an example of a synthesis activity or creating activity. When you predict is also a creating activity. When these concepts are linked, I see, blah, 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 that's a prompt also, okay, that is creating. Okay, and last, under higher order thinking skills is evaluation. It's expressing your own opinion, judging or value based on expressed criteria, ideas, and methods. Accept, appraise, assess, compare and contrast, critique, determine, evaluate, facilitate, grade, judge, justify, measure, rank, recommend, reject, select, and test. In your opinion, okay, for example, in your opinion, how is the city government, okay, how is the city government, in your opinion, how is the city government doing its best to prevent the spread of COVID-19? Okay, that is evaluation. You're judging something. Choose between and defend your answer. Okay, there's for example, there's a premise, and you have to choose whether you agree to that premise or not. A proposition, for example, you choose whether you agree to that proposition or not. Then you explain. That is evaluation. You explain your disagreement. You also explain your agreement to the proposition or to the premise. Then that is an example of evaluation. So these are the different levels under the Bloom's taxonomy of educational objectives. So next meeting we will continue our presentation on this. Then we will proceed also to our discussion of the 3 domains of learning. For this week, I will not be giving you any learning task yet because you need to focus reviewing your lesson for the prelim examination, which is set on Saturday, right? On Saturday. What time again, Mar? 4:30 to 6 or 6 to 7:30?
Sir? Yes?
What time?
No,
What time is the exam again on Saturday?
you
6
never,
now to
you never
7:30?
mentioned of the time, but you mentioned on Saturday. Not that time. No
So
time
we
yet.
do it. Can you do it at 6 to 7:30 if you're free on Saturday?
6 to 7:30 that evening. So,
Yes. Para sabay-sabay na kayo dun sa isang klase.
eh, sure. Sige po.
Okay, so 6 to 7:30 will be your prelim examination. So again, as I have said, I will not be giving you any task for this week. Okay, but for you to make use of the time to review your lesson for the for the prelim examination. Okay, so for today's discussion, we have the following who shared: Jamel Maborang, Jude Abuan, Marmora, Jennifer Dulin, Dian Langkay, Princess Pulintan. We have Daryl Takang and Joshua Morgado. Okay, so may I request the others to please make use of the remaining 10 minutes to share your learning takeaway. Okay, to share your learning takeaway using the chat box.
Sir.
Sir, ako po may tanong.
Yes.
Ay, wait lang po.
Sir, yung sa may photosynthesis, sir, paano din po kung halimbawa po binasa niya lang sa book and then ni-rephrase niya lang din po?
Yeah,
pa rin po ba siya
paraphrasing is part of comprehension.
Kahit po binase niya lang dun sa nabasa niya?
Yeah, okay lang. Basta ni-rephrase niya o pinaraphrase niya, that's still under comprehension. Na yan.
Eh sir, paano kung sabi niya is based on
Yung
sa nabasa niya?
That's not paraphrasing. Okay, kung based on what I have read, the definition of photosynthesis is this, tapos yung definition is exact lifting from the book, then that's no longer comprehension. What I mean by paraphrasing and rephrasing, Dayan, it's about the definition itself is being rephrased or it's being paraphrased. Okay, that's comprehension.
So,
sinabi niya na
so
based
sir,
on.
So sir, kung ni-rephrase din po is part pa rin siya ng comprehension and then kung
Yes.
hindi po siya, ay kung nag-base po siya is dun po siya part sa may remembering.
Depende sa pagkaka-state, Dayan. For example, okay, based on my understanding of the definition provided by this textbook, okay, I think photosynthesis is blah, 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 blah. Tapos yung mismong definition ay hindi talaga entotong lifted from the textbook, then that can still be qualified under comprehension. So depende sa pagkakasite ng estudyante. As a teacher, you can easily determine naman kung estudyante ay memorize lang niya yung konsepto, yung definition, or he or she made use of his own words in describing or defining a certain term. Okay?
So sir, saan din po part yung sa may based on? Wala po.
Dayan, sabi ko Dayan, ganito Dayan. Kapag sinabi niya na based on, ginamit niya yung term na based on, pero lifted and toto yung next statement niya na definition of photosynthesis sa libro, that cannot be qualified as comprehension. Okay? Wag tayo mag-refer din sa term na based on lang. When we decide whether the student is comprehending the lesson, we will not only base that skill of the student kung ginamit niya yung based on na term. Kasi nakadepende pa rin sa pagkakalahad ng estudyante ng pagpapakahulugan ng nasabing konsepto. Ginamit ko ang based on na term, Dayan, for example. Pero nung sinabi ko yung definition ng konsepto, hindi ko naman ginamit en toto o binuhat en toto yung nakita ko sa libro, nabasa ko sa libro, o yung memoryado ko sa libro. Then I am providing my own understanding already of the concept. Pero kung sinabi ko na based on, tapos nilift ko automatically kung ano yung nabasa ko, kung ano yung memorize kong definition, na kahit pag gumamit siya ng based on, under remembering level pa rin siya. Okay? Again, we will not confuse ourselves. We should not confuse ourselves na porke gumamit yung bata ng based on, automatic na comprehension level na siya. Okay? Titignan pa rin natin yung pagkakalahad ng estudyante. It's on how it is said and not on the words the student used to define a concept. Okay? Dayan?
Yes po sir, nakuha ko na.
Okay, so Dayan has recited. Yes, Princess?
Sir, pwede pong pa-clarify ulit yung difference between dun sa student's behavior tas yung criteria. Kasi
Okay.
based po dun sa kanina, what I observed a while ago, halos parehas po yung sagot kapag yun, dalawa.
As I have said a while back, the student behavior is the act that the students would do. Illustrate, apply, and others. And as I have said, the performance criteria in a learning outcome are usually hidden. Okay? Usually hindi mo siya makikita kaagad. Usually nakadugtong siya doon sa mismong gagawin ng estudyante, doon sa mismong student behavior. Okay? For example, yung sample natin kanina. Write, okay, write write sample learning outcomes, okay? Write sample learning outcomes to demonstrate one's understanding of the three domains of learning. Okay. The student behavior is writing the learning outcomes. Write learning outcomes, that's the action that I ask my students to do. The performance criteria is the completeness of the domains of learning. Okay. Kapag ni-rephrase ko yung sinabi ko, write learning outcomes along the three domains of learning to demonstrate understanding of the said, to demonstrate one's understanding of the said concepts. Ni-rephrase ko yun ha, dinugtong ko si learning domains doon sa student behavior. Okay. Saan ko matatagpuan si performance criteria? The completeness of the learning domains that you will write about. Okay, pero yung behavior ay yung learning, yung writing, the writing itself. Okay, Princess? Hidden lagi itong si hidden lagi, usually hidden po itong si performance criteria. Okay, another example. Create an assessment timeline. Okay, create an assessment timeline to demonstrate one's understanding of ongoing assessment. Okay. What is the student behavior? Create an assessment timeline. Okay. What is the method? Demonstrate ongoing assessment. Demonstration is the method. Now, what is the criteria? Ongoing assessment, hidden siya. Ongoing assessment, i-demonstrate nila. Assessment timeline. So the criteria is, hidden siya. Ang criteria ay, kapag gagawa pa ako ng assessment timeline, anong i-observe ko? Papasok yung tanong na iyon. Make sure na meron kang formative assessment, meron kang ipsative assessment, at meron ka ding summative assessment. Pero hidden itong tatlong ito doon sa term na assessment timeline. Okay, Princess? Princess?
Okay po, sir.
Yung mga iba na hindi mag-share, pwede nyo gamitin yung chat box for you to share your learning takeaway.
Pwede po magtanong ng last?
Yes, Bernadette.
Medyo magulo kasi para sa akin dito. Ano po yung pinagkaiba ng learning outcome, learning goal, and learning objective po?
Okay. And Princess, Bernadette, should I say, please do not forget to refer from our previous discussion because these have been discussed already. Remember, we say learning objective are written in the perspective of the teacher. Tama? In our previous discussion, that all objectives are written in the perspective of the teacher. If I will explain the lesson, then that is what I do as a teacher because that's my job as a teacher to explain the lesson. But if I would ask my students to, for example, objective, this is my objective as a teacher, explain the lesson, blah, blah, explain amalgamation and assimilation, then what will my students do? Okay, so for me to check that I already have explained the lesson, then I will ask them to provide examples of amalgamation and at the end of this discussion, students are expected to provide examples of amalgamation and assimilation. Then that is an example of learning outcome. Again, learning objectives are written in teacher's perspective, while learning outcomes are written in student's perspective. Okay, now how about learning goal? As I have said a while back, Bernadette, because this has already been asked a while back by, I think someone asked about goals a while back. Goals are broader than that of the learning outcomes and even learning objectives. Because learning goals are institutional in nature. Pag sabi ko institutional, we're referring to the whole educational institution, to the whole program, for the whole project, for example. That's what we mean by goals. So goals, we have objectives, and we have outcomes. Outcomes are more specific than goals and objectives. Okay, now, this is what I would like you to learn, class. Every one of you, this is what I would like you to learn. Do not just, when we discuss a lesson, do not just focus on the lesson itself that we are currently discussing. But also, while you are listening to our presentation, to our discussion, you also have to refer back from our previous discussion. Okay, and also, you also have to listen, okay, to others' questions, to your classmates' clarificatory questions, because it may happen that your question might have already been asked. Okay? And remember that we are in a synchronous video, in a synchronous learning. We are doing a video conference. And if you keep asking questions that your classmates have already asked and have already been clarified by me because it has already been asked by your classmate, then this would take us time again. And that would entail another expenses for your data and others. So these are things that we need to learn as we go through with our discussion, no? Okay, I am not just referring to Bernadette, pero there are already instances, Bernadette, your question is counted already as your recitation. There are many instances that students keep asking the question, okay, and without even recognizing that the said questions have already been asked and answered. So you also have to consider that, and also you have to review all our previous discussion. Kasi lahat ng mga talakayan natin ay magkakaugnay-ugnay na kailangan pagsamasamahin natin ang mga ito para lubusan natin maunawaan ang kabuuan ng mga bagay-bagay. Pero maganda rin na tanungin nyo uli nang sa ganun ay maalala ng bawat isa. Okay, Bernadette?
Thank you so much for enlightenment. Thank you, thank you.
Okay. So we already have Siza. I think Siza is one of those who perfected the quiz. Tama ba ako, Siza? Siza May?
Yes po, sir.
So what's the secret of perfecting the quiz?
Sir, nag-advance review lang po ng...
I hope the others will also do the same. Okay, so thank you for sharing. Any more who would like to share, you make use of the chat box, okay? Okay, it's already 6:01. So we end our video conference and thank you. Princess, okay na ba yung explanation ko kanina?
Yes, sir. Okay na po. Thank you po.
Okay, good. Okay, so may we have our...
Sir.
Yes, Mar? Mar? Okay. So may we have our closing prayer then to end our video conference for today. And may we listen to Princess. Princess, please lead us the closing prayer. Princess, please include in our prayer Miss Geronimo. Please include her in our prayer. Princess, please.
Okay po, so in the name of the Father, and the Son, the Holy Spirit, Amen. Heavenly Father, we again thank you for this day po. We thank you for allowing us to have this meeting and explore the beauty of assessment. We please keep our families safe from COVID, and we also ask you to, I would also, we also pray for those who contracted COVID. May Ate Christine rest in peace. And this we ask in Jesus' name, Amen. And Father and Son and Spirit.
Thank you, class, for attending today's conference. And please enjoy your night and the remaining hours of this day.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Nag-check ako ng LMS